The glass shattered before Gabriel even finished his sentence. Not because he threw anything, because the woman standing in front of him slammed a tray of empty wine glasses onto the counter so hard that one toppled and cracked on the tile floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look down at it. "Shout at me again," she said, voice low and steady, "and I'll finish you." Rain hammered against the windows of the harbor bistro, blurring the lights of the docks outside into smears of gold and red. Inside, the dinner rush was in full swing, every table full, waiters weaving between chairs, steam rising off plates of grilled fish and buttered bread. And in the middle of it stood Gabriel Reyes, soaked to the bone, his tailored coat dripping onto the floor, his face twisted with a fury that had been building for 3 straight hours. He'd just come from a meeting that had ended with a slammed door and a threat. Inspector Damien Vance, the man responsible for approving Gabriel's harbor redevelopment permit, had frozen the entire project. Millions of dollars, 2 years of planning, gone on the whim of a man who wanted a bigger bribe than what Gabriel had already quietly paid. So when Gabriel walked into the first restaurant he saw, soaked and seething, and nobody rushed to seat him, something in him snapped. "I've been standing here 5 minutes," he'd barked at the nearest staff member. "Do you know who I am?" That staff member was Marlo. She was not tall, she was not thin. She had flour on her sleeve and tired circles under her eyes from running the entire front of house alone because 2 servers had called out sick. And she did not care, even slightly, who Gabriel Reyes was. Now she stood inches from him, closer than strangers were supposed to stand, and there was nothing in her expression that looked like fear. "I don't care if you're the mayor," she said. "You're in my restaurant. Sit down, shut up, or leave. Those are the choices." For a second, Gabriel just stared at her. Nobody spoke to him like that. Not contractors, not city officials, not even his own men. People flinched around Gabriel Reyes. This woman looked like she was seconds from throwing him out bodily, apron and all. And then something caught his eye. Past her shoulder, on a small corner booth table, sat an open laptop. On the screen was a detailed 3D rendering, professional grade, layered with zoning overlays, tidal flow arrows, elevation markers. It was a full urban planning model of the harbor. His harbor. His anger stalled out completely. "What is that?" he said, quieter now, nodding toward the screen. Marlo glanced back, unbothered. "That's my dinner break, not that it's your business." "That's a coastal drainage simulation," Gabriel said slowly. "For Zone 14. That's my project." She raised an eyebrow, arms crossed. "It's a project the city's been mismanaging for a decade. I was tweaking the runoff modeling because the last public draft was garbage. Structurally naive, honestly. Whoever designed the original seawall clearance clearly never worked a coastline job in his life." Gabriel opened his mouth, then closed it. He was the guy who signed off on that original seawall clearance. He turned, raised 2 fingers toward the door. 2 men in dark suits, waiting just outside under the awning, straightened immediately. "Wait outside," Gabriel said. "I mean it. Outside, in the rain. Don't argue." They went. Marlo watched this exchange with narrowed eyes, recalculating something behind her expression, though she didn't say what. "You run security like a man who's used to needing it," she said. "You run a restaurant like you're not scared of anyone," Gabriel replied.
How does a waitress know coastal drainage modeling?
She let out a short laugh, more tired than amused.
I have a master's in urban design, top of my program. I spent 4 years at a planning firm downtown before I walked out and never looked back.
"Why would you leave that to sling plates in the rain?" Marlo's jaw tightened, just slightly, the first real crack in her composure all night.
Because that firm cared more about which developer paid the biggest kickback than which design actually held up during a flood. I got tired of watching good projects die so bad men could get richer. This bistro was my grandmother's. It's honest, Nobody here is lying to me for money.
Gabriel said nothing. The words landed harder than she could have known, because he was, by most definitions, exactly the kind of man she'd just described. A man used to buying his way through problems. A man whose own family name still made certain city officials uneasy for reasons that had nothing to do with permits. But there was something else nagging at him now, colder than his earlier anger. That drainage model on her screen wasn't just accurate. It was better than his own engineer's version. Better in a way that would have made his original design obsolete if the city had ever seen it. Which meant this waitress, standing in her flour-dusted apron in a bistro on the very block Vance wanted condemned, might already know exactly how to save his project. Or exactly how to bury it. "I need to talk to you," Gabriel said. "Not as a customer, as someone who might need your help." Marlowe looked at him for a long moment, rain still drumming against the glass behind her, and did not smile. "Then stop shouting," she said, "and start explaining." 2 nights passed before Gabriel worked up the nerve to go back. It wasn't fear, exactly. Gabriel Reyes didn't do fear, but something about the way Marlowe had looked at him, steady, unimpressed, completely unwilling to bend, had rattled him more than any council meeting or backroom threat ever had. Men like Vance he knew how to handle. Corruption had a shape he understood. But a woman who ran a bistro like a fortress and modeled coastal engineering for fun on her dinner break? That was new territory. So on the 3rd night, after closing, he showed up at the back door of the Harbor Bistro carrying a white box tied with string. Inside were pastries from the one bakery in the city that didn't take reservations under a fake name, the kind of place Gabriel usually sent an assistant to visit, not himself. Marlowe was wiping down the last table on the covered patio when she saw him standing at the edge of the dock lights, soaked coat replaced with a dry one, hands shoved awkwardly in his pockets, like a man who'd forgotten how to apologize. "We're closed," she said. "I know. I'm not here to eat." He held up the box. "I'm here to say I was an ass on Tuesday." She stared at him for a long beat, then set down her rag. "Keep talking?" They ended up sitting across from each other at the patio's corner table, the one closest to the water, where the rain had finally slowed to a mist and the harbor lights blinked lazily against the dark. Marlowe made espresso from the machine behind the bar. Real espresso, not the sludge Gabriel's office kept brewing, and for a while neither of them spoke about permits or projects at all. "Your grandmother started this place?" Gabriel asked, mostly to fill the silence. 40 years ago, she came here with nothing and built this with her hands, one plate at a time. Marlowe wrapped both palms around her cup. "I used to think I'd never end up working here. I had bigger plans, skyscrapers, master plans for entire districts. I thought I was going to change how this city grew. What happened?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "I got hired at Denholm & Cross. Best firm in the state, supposedly. My first big project was a mixed-income housing development. Real housing, not luxury condos with a token affordable unit stuffed in the basement. I spent 8 months on that design. Then, 2 weeks before groundbreaking, the whole thing got gutted. Half the affordable units disappeared. Nobody explained why. I found out later a city inspector had been quietly paid to reclassify the zoning, and the firm just let it happen. Because saying no to that inspector meant losing every future project he touched. Gabriel's stomach tightened, because he already knew exactly the kind of inspector she meant. He'd paid that kind of man himself, more than once, back when his family's name still opened certain doors with cash instead of paperwork. "I quit the next month," Marlowe continued. "Told myself I'd rather serve honest food to honest people than design buildings for men who'd sell out an entire neighborhood to save themselves a headache." Gabriel set his cup down slowly. "The inspector who did that to you, was it Vance?" Marlowe's eyes snapped up. "How do you know that name?" "Because he's doing the same thing to me right now." Gabriel exhaled, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he let the exhaustion show on his face. Vance froze my harbor permit, not because there's anything wrong with the design, because I stopped paying what he wanted. He's demanding triple what I already gave him, and when I refused, he told me, not directly but close enough, that if I don't pay, he'll find a way to kill the project entirely. That's illegal, Marlowe said flatly. Everything Vance does is illegal. That's never stopped him. Gabriel leaned forward. But it gets worse. My people found paperwork last week, a preliminary blight assessment. Vance is trying to get this entire block, this street, declared a hazard zone. Structurally unsound, code violations, the whole script. If it goes through, the city can force a buyout at a fraction of market value. Marlowe went very still. This block, my bistro. Yours, specifically, Gabriel said quietly. I think he's targeting it because it's the anchor property. If your building falls, the whole block goes down with it, and he clears the way for whoever's paying him this time. Might even be connected to my own project, clearing land near the harbor to sell higher once my development goes through, if he lets it. For a moment, Marlowe said nothing at all. She just stared out at the black water, jaw tight, hands wrapped so hard around her cup that her knuckles had gone pale. He's using the exact same playbook, she said finally. The one that killed my housing project. Just aimed at a different target now. Yes. And you want my help fighting him? Gabriel hesitated, because the honest answer wasn't simple. I want to fight him and win without becoming him. I've spent my whole life solving problems with money and muscle. I don't know how to beat a man like Vance in a courtroom or a council chamber. You do. You know the codes. You know the loopholes. You saw right through my own engineer's design in 5 minutes at your dinner table. Marlowe studied him, really studied him, the way she might study a flawed blueprint, searching for the crack that would tell her whether the whole structure was rotten or just needed reinforcement. If I help you, she said slowly, it's not because I like you. It's because Vance doesn't get to do this twice, not to me and not to anyone else he decides to squeeze. Understood. And if I find one thing in your original harbor design that's dishonest, one shortcut, one bribe, one corner cut to save you money at somebody else's expense, I walk, immediately, no matter how far we've gotten. Gabriel met her eyes without blinking. Bring the blueprints to your place. I'll show you everything. All of it. Marlowe finally allowed herself something close to a smile. Thin, but real. Then we start tomorrow morning. And Gabriel, don't be late. I don't wait twice for anyone. Marlowe's apartment was nothing like Gabriel expected. He'd pictured something small and cluttered, maybe a few plants dying on a windowsill. Instead, he found a converted loft above a print shop, the walls lined floor to ceiling with rolled maps, drafting tools, and a corkboard covered in photographs of half-finished buildings, some triumphant, some clearly abandoned mid-construction. A drafting table sat by the window, angled to catch the morning light, and on it sat a coffee pot, already half-empty. "You're 2 minutes late," Marlowe said without looking up from the table. "I stopped for coffee." "I have coffee." "Better coffee." She glanced at the paper cups in his hands, unimpressed, and gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit. Blueprints out. Let's see what I'm actually dealing with." Gabriel unrolled the first set of plans across the table, weighing down the corners with a stapler, a mug, and, because Marlowe insisted with a completely straight face, a chipped ceramic frog she said had sentimental authority over the workspace. For a while, she didn't speak at all. She just moved along the paper with her fingertip, tracing lines, flipping between the harbor design and a second folder of zoning maps she pulled from a drawer without needing to look for it. Gabriel watched her work in silence, sipping the coffee he'd brought, and found himself studying her more than the blueprints. There was something almost hypnotic about how her mind moved. She didn't scan the design the way his engineers did, checking boxes, confirming code compliance line by line. She looked for the story of the building, how water would move across it during a storm, how people would actually walk through it at rush hour, not how the diagrams said they should. She caught things his six-figure engineering firm had missed entirely.
"Here," she said finally, tapping a section near the lower promenade.
"This is your problem." Gabriel leaned in. "The drainage grading?" "The drainage grading," she confirmed. "Your design routes storm runoff straight toward the coastal buffer zone. On paper it looks fine because your engineer used the old flood maps, the ones from before the last two hurricane seasons redrew the floodplain. But the actual coastal runoff ordinance changed 18 months ago. Nobody updated your model." "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning if this design ever reaches a real inspection, an honest one, not one of Vance's bought ones, it fails automatically. No appeal, no workaround. It's not a bribery issue. It's an actual, provable legal violation." She sat back, arms crossed, something almost like pity in her expression. "Vance doesn't even need to fabricate anything against you. He just needs someone with half a brain to actually read this properly, and your project collapses on its own." Gabriel felt his stomach drop. 2 years, millions of dollars, and an oversight that basic could sink the whole thing. Can it be fixed? Everything can be fixed. Whether you have the patience for it is a different question. Marlowe pulled a fresh sheet toward her and began sketching, fast, confident lines that turned into a revised grading plan before his eyes. "You reroute the runoff here, add a secondary retention basin along this stretch, and suddenly you're not just meeting the new ordinance, you're exceeding it. Which matters, because it means Vance can't manufacture a violation here, even if he wanted to." "You're doing this from memory," Gabriel said, half a question, half disbelief. "I read ordinance updates the way other people read gossip columns," she said dryly, not looking up. "It's a character flaw." He laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, the first one he'd allowed himself in weeks. Marlowe glanced up at the sound like she hadn't expected it either. "What?" she asked. "Nothing, it's just—" Gabriel shook his head. "I've spent 2 years surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear. My engineers said this design was airtight. My lawyers said Vance's demands were just business as usual. Everyone around me either flatters me or fears me. You've done neither since the moment I met you." Marlowe set down her pencil. "Do you want flattery, or do you want a building that doesn't collapse?" "I want the building." "Then stop being surprised when someone just tells you the truth." She pulled the revised sheet toward him. "This is the first draft. It'll need real engineers to formalize it, obviously, but the bones are sound, assuming your original design wasn't hiding anything else you haven't told me about." There it was, the line she'd drawn the night before, still standing firm in daylight. "It's not," Gabriel said. "I promise you, this project, whatever else you think of me, this one's clean. I wanted the harbor rebuilt properly, housing above the shops, real public access to the waterfront, not another gated development for people who'll never actually live here." Marlowe studied him for a long moment, the same searching look she'd given him on the patio 2 nights before. "That's not what I expected from you." "What did you expect?" "Someone building a monument to himself." She shrugged, picking the pencil back up. "Instead, I'm looking at someone actually trying to fix something. It's an inconvenient thing to admit, honestly." "Why inconvenient?" "Because it's easier to help someone I don't respect," she said simply, not quite meeting his eyes now. "Makes the boundaries clearer." Gabriel didn't push it further, though something in his chest had shifted, quiet and unfamiliar. He watched her work for another hour, the two of them trading notes over the drafting table as the sun rose higher over the print shop below, and found himself thinking, not for the first time that morning, that he had spent his entire adult life mistaking aggression for strength. Marlowe hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. By the time the coffee ran cold, they had a revised design that could actually survive an honest inspection, and Gabriel had the growing, uneasy sense that Vance wasn't going to let this fight stay honest for long. Vance came on a Tuesday, which Marlowe would later say was exactly like him, a man who thought Tuesdays were too ordinary for anyone to be paying attention. She was mid-shift, apron dusted with flour, carrying a tray of iced coffees out to the promenade tables, when she saw the small procession moving down the boardwalk. Inspector Damien Vance, in a grey suit 2 sizes too sharp for a man his age, flanked by 2 city surveyors carrying clipboards and a tape measure, like props in a play they hadn't rehearsed. Behind them trailed a photographer Marlowe didn't recognize, which told her everything. This wasn't a routine check. This was documentation for a case Vance had already decided the outcome of. She set the tray down without breaking stride and walked straight toward them.
Can I help you, Inspector?
Vance smiled the way men like him always smiled. Thin, practiced, entirely without warmth. Emergency structural review, Ms. Voss. Anonymous complaint about foundation cracking along this stretch of the boardwalk. Standard procedure. There's no anonymous complaint, Marlowe said. There's no case number posted anywhere on the public registry, which is required 48 hours before an emergency inspection under Municipal Code 12-41. I checked this morning. There's nothing filed. Vance's smile faltered, just slightly. The filing is in progress. Then the inspection is in progress of being illegal. Marlowe crossed her arms, planting herself directly between Vance and the surveyors, who had already started measuring a hairline crack near the bistro's foundation, a crack that had been there since her grandmother's time.
Cosmetic and completely harmless.
You don't get to declare an emergency after the fact to justify walking onto private property with a camera crew.
This block poses a documented safety concern, Vance said, louder now, clearly aware that a small crowd of morning customers had started to gather along the railing. I have every right.
You have every right to follow the law, Marlowe cut in, which you are currently not doing. Show me the case number. Show me the 48-hour public notice, or pack up your tape measure and leave my property.
For a moment, Vance said nothing, and Marlowe watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The same calculation she'd watched a dozen bought inspectors make at her old firm, weighing whether the woman in front of him actually knew the code or was bluffing. She held his gaze without blinking, without raising her voice, and let the silence do the work. That's when Gabriel arrived. He came down the boardwalk fast, coat open, phone still in hand from whatever call had alerted him. Marlowe would learn later that one of the gathering customers had texted his office the moment they recognized Vance's face. But he didn't come the way Marlowe half expected, the way she'd braced for without quite admitting it. No security detail, no raised voice, no threat. He simply walked up and stood beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. "Inspector Vance," Gabriel said, calm and cold in a way that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. "I believe Ms. Voss asked you a question about your documentation." Vance's eyes flicked between them, and something shifted in his expression, recalculating again, this time factoring in a variable he clearly hadn't expected. Gabriel Reyes, standing on the side of the woman he was trying to condemn, not the side of the developer he was trying to extort.
"Mr. Reyes," Vance said carefully, "this doesn't concern your project."
"It concerns the block my project sits next to," Gabriel replied, "which means it concerns me. And it concerns the reporter I imagine is already on his way, since I texted 3 of them the moment I heard you were down here without proper notice."
That landed. Marlowe saw it land, the flicker of genuine alarm crossing Vance's face before he smoothed it back into practiced calm. "There's no need for that kind of escalation," Vance said.
"There's no need for illegal inspections either," Marlowe said, "and yet here we are."
One of the surveyors, younger than the others, lowered his clipboard slightly, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Vance noticed it too, noticed the crowd along the railing now filming on their phones, noticed the 2 reporters Gabriel had apparently actually summoned climbing out of a cab at the end of the boardwalk.
"We'll reschedule," Vance said abruptly, "once proper documentation is filed."
"You do that," Marlowe said. Vance turned to leave, motioning his surveyors to pack up. But he paused just before stepping off the boardwalk, looking back at the two of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the bistro. "You should both be careful," he said, voice low enough that only Gabriel and Marlowe could hear it now. "The council vote is in 8 days. Things have a way of falling apart right before a vote. Buildings, reputations, partnerships." His eyes lingered deliberately on Marlowe. "Even people, sometimes." "Is that a threat, Inspector?" Gabriel asked, his voice perfectly level. "It's a weather forecast," Vance said, and walked away, his surveyors trailing behind him like a funeral procession that had lost its purpose. The crowd began to disperse once the show was over, phones lowering, customers drifting back to their coffee. Marlowe let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. "You called reporters," she said. "I called reporters," Gabriel confirmed. "That wasn't the plan." "There wasn't a plan. There was you, standing in front of a man trying to destroy your grandmother's restaurant, and I wasn't going to let you do that alone." Gabriel looked at her, something unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there 3 days ago in the rain. "You didn't need me to save you. You had him cornered before I even got here." "Maybe," Marlowe admitted, "but it didn't feel like standing alone. That was new." Gabriel didn't answer that directly. He just glanced down the boardwalk where Vance had disappeared, jaw tight. 8 days, he said quietly. He's not bluffing about the timeline. Whatever he's planning before that council vote, it's going to be worse than a fake inspection. Marlowe picked her tray back up, hands steadier now, and looked at him with something new in her eyes. Not just wariness anymore, but something that looked dangerously close to trust. "Then we'd better be ready for it," she said, "because men like Vance don't threaten twice. They just act." The invitation arrived on cream cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that made Marlowe's kitchen counter feel suddenly too small for it. The Harborlight Foundation Charity Gala, Grand Hotel Ballroom, black tie. "Absolutely not," she said, sliding it back across the counter toward Gabriel, who had shown up unannounced during her lunch lull, still in his work suit, looking entirely too pleased with himself. 3 of the 5 independent council members will be there, Gabriel said. The ones Vance hasn't managed to buy or intimidate yet. If they walk into that vote next week having already met you, having already heard your redesign explained in your own words instead of through a filing cabinet of paperwork, we don't need to win an argument in the chamber. We just need to remind them what's true. I run a restaurant. I don't attend galas. You have a master's degree from the best program in the state, and you just out-argued a corrupt city inspector on your own front porch without raising your voice, Gabriel said. You'll be fine. Marlowe folded her arms, unconvinced, but 3 days later, she found herself standing in front of a full-length mirror in a dress she hadn't worn since her sister's wedding, feeling less like herself than she had in years. And, if she was honest, a little thrilled by it, too. The Grand Hotel Ballroom was everything the bistro wasn't. Marble floors instead of scuffed tile, chandeliers instead of string lights, a string quartet instead of the radio Marlowe usually left playing behind the bar. She felt every inch the outsider walking in on Gabriel's arm, his hand steady at the small of her back, until she reminded herself that she'd walked into rooms exactly like this one for 4 years at Denholm and Cross, and she'd survived those men just fine. There, Gabriel murmured, nodding toward a cluster near the bar. Councilwoman Ibarra, Councilman Ochoa, and Councilman Whitfield, all 3 independent, all 3 still undecided on the vote. Then let's go remind them what undecided actually means. She moved through the introductions with an ease that surprised even her, trading pleasantries about the harbor project, the ordnance updates, the floodplain remapping nobody else in the room seemed to have actually read. Councilwoman Ibarra, sharp-eyed and visibly bored by the small talk around her, perked up the moment Marlowe mentioned the retention basin redesign. You did the modeling yourself? Ibarra asked. Every line of it, Marlowe said. I'd be happy to walk you through the technical review whenever you'd like. No spin, just the numbers. It was going well, better than well, until two men in expensive suits drifted over from the bar, drinks in hand, wearing the particular smirk of men who assumed everyone in the room existed to be impressed by them. Marlowe recognized the type instantly. She'd catered to worse at the bistro on a slow Tuesday.
Gabriel, one of them said, ignoring Marlowe entirely at first. Didn't expect to see you at one of these. Thought charity wasn't really the family business. Gabriel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly.
Nikolai, didn't know you'd been invited. Invitations are flexible when you know the right people. Nikolai's eyes finally landed on Marlowe, sweeping over her dress with an expression that made her skin crawl slightly. And who's this? New arm candy? Or is she catering the event? The councilwoman beside them stiffened, clearly recognizing the insult for what it was. Marlowe felt Gabriel's hand tense against her back, felt the old version of him, the one who solved insults with fists or worse, coiling just beneath the surface. She stepped forward instead, smiling pleasantly.
I actually do own a restaurant, she said. Family business, 40 years running, no offshore accounts required. And I hold a master's in urban planning, which is more than I can say for the last 3 harbor proposals your firm submitted, Nikolai. All 3 rejected for the exact same drainage miscalculation. Did nobody there ever update the flood maps, or was that just easier than admitting the mistake? The smirk slid off Nikolai's face like water off glass. His companion laughed before catching himself, badly disguising it as a cough.
I don't know what you're talking about, Nikolai said stiffly.
I do, Councilwoman Ibarra said, arms crossed now, watching Marlowe with open interest.
Your firm's last proposal got flagged by the planning office for exactly that. I remember the memo. Councilman Ochoa leaned in, genuinely curious now. You said you did the modeling yourself. What would you change about Nikolai's design, specifically? For the next 10 minutes, Marlowe held court in the middle of the ballroom, walking 3 council members through the exact flaws in a competing firm's harbor bid, while Nikolai stood red-faced and increasingly silent beside them. By the time she finished, Councilman Whitfield was scribbling notes on the back of a cocktail napkin, and Councilwoman Ibarra had asked twice if Marlowe would consider consulting on future city planning reviews, regardless of how the harbor vote turned out. Nikolai and his friend drifted away without another word, defeated by facts in a way Gabriel's fists never could have managed.
That was, Gabriel started, once they'd finally found a quieter corner near the terrace doors.
Satisfying, Marlowe offered. I was going to say terrifying, in the best way. He looked at her with something between admiration and disbelief. You just dismantled a man worth 8 figures using flood maps. Flood maps don't lie, Marlowe said. People do. It's why I trust the maps more. Gabriel laughed, and for a moment the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade around them. The string quartet, the clinking glasses, the low murmur of 100 conversations that had nothing to do with either of them. He was looking at her the way she imagined he'd once looked at his family's old business ambitions, before all of it curdled into something he was still trying to outrun. Focused, hungry, genuinely alive. 3 council members just watched you win an argument you didn't even need me for, he said quietly. I didn't need you for it, Marlowe agreed. Then, softer, almost surprising herself, but I'm glad you were standing next to me anyway. Across the ballroom, unnoticed by either of them, a man near the entrance lowered his phone after finishing a text message, a quiet update sent straight to Inspector Vance, reporting exactly how badly the evening had gone for anyone hoping Marlowe Voss would embarrass herself in front of the council. Vance would need a different plan now, and he already had one waiting. The rooftop conservatory was almost empty by the time they found it, a quiet glass room above the ballroom, filled with potted palms and the hush of a city that looked, from up here, almost peaceful. The noise of the gala drifted up faintly through the open terrace doors below, but up here, it was just the 2 of them and the skyline, glittering under a clear night sky that had finally shaken off the week's rain. Marlowe leaned against the railing, her heels finally off, dangling from one hand. I needed 5 minutes away from Nikolai's cologne. I needed 5 minutes away from being Gabriel Reyes, Gabriel said, and there was something in his voice that made her turn and look at him properly. What does that mean? He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the harbor lights in the distance, the same waterfront they'd spent the last week fighting to save. My father built our family's name on fear. People did business with us because they were afraid not to. I grew up thinking that was strength. I thought if I shouted loud enough, paid enough, threatened enough, I could build anything I wanted. He shook his head slowly. It took me 34 years to realize that's not building anything. That's just borrowing other people's compliance until they find a way to stop being afraid. Is that why you tried to buy Vance off instead of reporting him? Marlowe asked, not unkindly.
That's exactly why. Because for years that's all I knew how to do, pay the problem to go away. Gabriel's jaw tightened. And then I met a waitress who threatened to finish me in the middle of her own restaurant, and somehow that was the first time in a decade someone actually made me stop and think instead of just react. Marlowe let out a soft laugh, surprised by how gently he said it. I really did almost throw a tray at your head. I deserved it. You did. She turned to face him fully now, the city lights catching the edge of her dress, the flower-dusted apron of a week ago feeling like it belonged to a different lifetime already. Can I tell you something? Something I haven't said out loud yet. Always. I'm terrified I'm going to lose the bistro anyway. Her voice wavered slightly, the confident edge she'd carried all week finally cracking just a little under the weight of it. Not because of the drainage models or the ordinances, because Vance is the kind of man who doesn't stop just because he's been embarrassed once. My grandmother built that place with nothing. If I lose it, I don't just lose a building. I lose the only thing that's ever felt like mine. Gabriel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion behind his eyes too, the same fear wearing a different face. Then let me tell you something back. No matter what happens with the harbor vote, no matter what Vance does next, your bistro is not going down. I don't care if I have to buy the entire block myself to keep it out of his hands. That restaurant survives this. I promise you that. You can't promise something like that. I can, and I am. His voice was steady, none of the performative confidence he wore in boardrooms, just quiet certainty. For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to build something to prove my father wrong, or to prove the city can't push my family around anymore. I'm trying to build something because it's right, and you're the reason I finally understand the difference. Marlowe looked at him for a long moment, the wind off the harbor stirring loose strands of hair around her face, and something in her expression softened completely. The guarded edge she'd kept up since the night he'd stormed into her restaurant finally, quietly, giving way. My grandmother used to say the city eats people like us, she said softly. People who try to do things honestly. She used to say it'll grind you down until you either give up or become just like the men you're fighting. Has it ground you down? Not yet. A small, tired smile. Not completely, anyway. Then let's make sure it never does. Gabriel reached out, tucking that loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering there a moment longer than necessary. I know I'm not the man you probably imagined standing beside you when you pictured how all this would go. But I'd like to be, if you'll let me. Marlowe didn't answer with words. She closed the small distance between them instead, and Gabriel met her halfway, the kiss slow and certain, nothing rushed about it. The culmination of a week that had started with shouting and threats, and somehow, impossibly, arrived here instead. When they finally pulled back, the city lights blurred slightly behind them both. Marlowe let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. I threatened to finish you 4 days ago, she murmured. You did. This isn't quite what I meant. Gabriel laughed, low and warm, resting his forehead against hers.
I'll take it anyway. Below them, the gala continued without them, oblivious to the moment unfolding on the quiet rooftop above. But far across the city, in a dim office lit only by a desk lamp, Inspector Vance sat reading a report from his utilities contact, a man he'd paid well over the years for exactly this kind of favor. Vance smiled thinly and picked up his phone. "Tonight," he said, once the call connected. "Before the lunch rush tomorrow. Make it look like an accident." He hung up without waiting for a reply, already certain of what the morning would bring. The smell of gas woke Marlowe before her alarm did. It was faint at first, drifting up through the floorboards of her apartment above the bistro's storage room, easy to dismiss as a stove left improperly closed. But by the time she'd pulled on jeans and a sweater and made her way downstairs, the smell had grown sharper, thicker, unmistakable. And the moment she pushed through the kitchen door, she understood exactly how bad this was. The gas line behind the industrial range had been tampered with, a valve cracked just enough to leak slowly rather than catastrophically, the kind of damage that wouldn't trigger an obvious alarm, but would fill the kitchen with enough gas by mid-morning to turn one careless spark into a disaster. And when she checked the utility closet in the back hallway, her stomach dropped further. The water main had been shut off entirely, the emergency valve twisted closed, and the access panel locked with a padlock that hadn't been there the night before. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called Gabriel before she'd even finished processing what she was looking at. "There's gas leaking in my kitchen," she said the moment he picked up, her voice tighter than she wanted it to be. "And someone shut off my water main and locked the panel. This isn't an accident, Gabriel. Someone did this on purpose, in the middle of the night." "I'm coming," he said, already moving. She could hear it in his voice, keys jangling, a door slamming somewhere on his end of the line. "Don't touch anything else. Don't turn on any lights. Don't use the stove. Get everyone out of the building until I get there." "The lunch rush is in 3 hours." "Then we have 3 hours to fix this properly and prove exactly who did it." He arrived faster than Marlowe thought possible, and not with the 2 suited men she'd half expected after their first meeting in the rain. Instead, he brought a small crew of people in work jackets stitched with the logo of Reyes Structural Engineering, a licensed firm, she'd later learn, that Gabriel had quietly acquired years ago and rarely used publicly, preferring his usual contractors for most jobs. But not for this. "This is Dana," Gabriel said, introducing a woman with a tool belt and a no-nonsense expression, already documenting the gas valve with a small camera. "Licensed structural engineer, 20 years in the field. And that's Miguel, our utilities specialist. Whatever happened here, they're going to document every inch of it before we fix a single thing." Dana crouched by the range, examining the cracked valve with a critical eye. "This wasn't wear and tear," she said after a moment, photographing the fitting from 3 different angles. "Somebody used a wrench on this. You can see the tool marks here, fresh scoring on the brass. This was deliberately loosened, not failed." Miguel, meanwhile, had made his way to the utility closet, cutting through the unauthorized padlock with bolt cutters and photographing the valve itself. "Same story here. Emergency shutoff was forced closed manually. And this lock..." He held it up, turning it over. "This isn't city property. City locks are stamped. This is a hardware store padlock somebody installed themselves." "Who has access to do something like this overnight?" Marlowe asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Utility contractors," Gabriel said grimly. "City-authorized ones, usually, which means whoever did this either works for the city directly or was paid by someone who does." "Vance," Marlowe said. "Vance," Gabriel agreed. Dana finished her documentation and stood, wiping her hands on a rag. "I've got time-stamped photos, close-ups of the tool marks, and I'll pull the maintenance logs from the gas company to confirm there was no scheduled work here last night. If this ends up in front of a judge or a council, this is about as clean a paper trail of tampering as I've ever seen. Whoever did this was sloppy. Confident, maybe. Didn't think anyone would look this closely." "He didn't think anyone with real engineers would show up before lunch," Gabriel said. He expected chaos. A gas leak, a burst pipe, maybe an actual fire if he got unlucky, or lucky, depending on how you look at it. Enough damage to justify condemning the building on safety grounds before the council vote even happens. Marlowe stood in the middle of her own kitchen, arms wrapped around herself, watching two strangers document the attempted destruction of the only thing her grandmother had ever built, and felt something shift inside her. Not fear anymore, but a cold, focused anger that steadied her hands rather than shaking them. "Fix it," she said quietly. "Fix all of it. Today, before the lunch rush." "That's the plan," Gabriel said. It took 3 hours of careful, methodical work, Miguel repairing the water main properly and restoring service, Dana overseeing a full safety check on every gas line in the building to make sure nothing else had been tampered with, Gabriel himself on the phone with the actual city utility office, confirming, on record, that no work order had ever been filed for this address the night before. By 11:45, the kitchen was safe again, the water running, the ovens humming back to life exactly 7 minutes before the first lunch customers began arriving, completely unaware of how close they'd come to walking into a disaster. Marlowe stood at the counter afterward, watching her staff move through the familiar rhythm of service, and finally let herself exhale. "He almost had us," she said quietly, more to herself than to Gabriel. "He didn't," Gabriel corrected, standing beside her. "And now we have him. Dana's report, the time-stamped photos, the confirmation there was no legitimate work order. That's not speculation anymore. That's evidence of a city official orchestrating criminal sabotage against a private business right before a permit vote." Marlowe turned to look at him, something fierce and grateful flickering behind her eyes. "You didn't come here with muscle this time." "I came here with people who actually know how to fight him," Gabriel said. "Turns out that works a lot better." Across the city, in his office, Vance's phone buzzed with a message from his utilities contact. A single, panicked line informing him the job had failed, the bistro was fully operational again, and worse, that someone had documented everything. Vance stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down slowly. The council vote was 3 days away, and for the first time since this whole scheme began, he understood he might actually lose. The council chamber was packed by 2 in the afternoon, every seat filled, and a line of reporters standing along the back wall with cameras angled toward the podium. Word had spread fast in 3 days, a leaked photo here, a whispered rumor there, that something bigger than a routine harbor permit vote was about to unfold. Marlowe sat in the front row beside Gabriel, a folder of documents in her lap, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been in her own kitchen 3 days earlier. She'd worn the sharp navy suit Gabriel had quietly had tailored for her that week, though she'd insisted on paying him back for it later. And beneath the podium lights, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had once designed buildings for a living and had never stopped being good at it. Inspector Vance took the podium first, his manner as polished and confident as ever, sliding a thick folder across to the council clerk. "Members of the council," he began. "After extensive review, my office recommends rejection of the proposed harbor redevelopment on grounds of insufficient stormwater management, and further recommends condemnation proceedings begin immediately on the adjacent bistro block, cited for repeated safety code violations documented over the past several inspections." He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, citing outdated flood maps, gesturing vaguely at photographs of a hairline crack that had existed harmlessly for decades, painting a picture of negligence and danger that, to anyone unfamiliar with the actual details, might have sounded convincing. When he finished, Councilwoman Ibarra leaned toward her microphone. "Inspector, before we proceed, I understand the Harbor Project's planning team has requested time to present a rebuttal. Given the seriousness of these recommendations, I think it's only fair we hear it." Vance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course." Marlowe stood. She walked to the podium without hesitation, set her folder down, and connected her laptop to the chamber's projector without waiting for permission. the redesigned harbor model filling the screen behind her in crisp, layered detail. Drainage flow, retention basins, the updated floodplain data Vance's own office had quietly ignored for 18 months.
"My name is Marlo Voss," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I hold a master's degree in urban planning, and I've served as lead design consultant on the revised harbor proposal. I'd like to walk the council through exactly why Inspector Vance's stormwater objection is not just outdated, but factually incorrect." For the next 12 minutes, she dismantled his report piece by piece, showing the council the exact ordinance update his office had failed to apply, the retention basin redesign that exceeded current code by a comfortable margin, the independent engineering sign-off from a licensed firm confirming every measurement. Councilman Whitfield, who'd taken notes on a cocktail napkin at the gala a week earlier, now sat forward with genuine engagement, cross-referencing her presentation against his own copy of the ordinance. "This addresses the harbor project," Ibarra said once Marlo paused. "But Inspector Vance also recommended condemnation of the bistro block. What's your response to that?"
Marlo's expression hardened, just slightly. "I'd like to show the council something else." She pulled up a new file, video footage, time-stamped and clearly labeled, showing Dana crouched by the cracked gas valve, narrating the fresh tool marks into her camera. Then Miguel, cutting through the unauthorized padlock on the water main, holding up the hardware store lock for the camera. Then a screen capture of the city utility office's own records, confirming no work order had been filed for that address on the night in question. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's pen scratched furiously against a notepad.
"3 nights ago," Marlo said, her voice steady despite the current running underneath it. "Someone deliberately sabotaged the gas and water lines to my family's restaurant, the same building Inspector Vance is recommending for condemnation today. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't wear and tear. It was manufactured damage, timed precisely to occur before this vote, presumably to manufacture the exact safety crisis Inspector Vance has just described to this council." Vance shot to his feet. "This is an outrageous accusation. The utility contractor who performed the shutoff has been identified," Marlo continued, unshaken. "And city records confirm he's been paid directly by Inspector Vance's office on at least 4 prior occasions over the past 2 years, always immediately preceding disputed inspections. I have those payment records here as well, obtained through a public records request filed last week." The chamber erupted. Councilwoman Ibarra banged her gavel twice, though it did little to quiet the sudden roar of reporters murmuring into phones and council members leaning toward each other in stunned conversation. Vance stood frozen at his podium, his practiced composure finally completely cracking, color draining from his face as 3 council members began flipping through the printed payment records Marlo's assistant had quietly distributed to each seat. "Inspector Vance," Ibarra said, once the chamber had settled enough for her voice to carry, "you'll need to answer these allegations formally, and I'm ordering an immediate internal investigation, effective today, pending review by the City Ethics Board." Vance opened his mouth, closed it, then gathered his folder with hands that were visibly shaking, and walked out of the chamber without another word, flashbulbs following him the entire way to the door. The vote, when it finally came 20 minutes later, was unanimous. The harbor project approved. The condemnation proceedings against the bistro block dismissed entirely, with Ibarra adding, pointedly, that the council would be reviewing every prior recommendation Inspector Vance had made over the past 3 years. Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed, shouting questions Marlo hadn't expected to face, about the harbor, about the sabotage, about her own history at Denman Cross, which someone had apparently already dug up. Gabriel stood close beside her through all of it, not speaking for her, just present, the same way he'd been on the promenade weeks earlier. When they finally broke free of the crowd and reached the quiet of the parking garage, Marlo leaned against a concrete pillar and let out a breath that seemed to release the entire week at once. "We won," she said, almost like she didn't quite believe it. "You won," Gabriel corrected. "I just stood next to you." "That's not nothing," Marlo said softly. Neither of them noticed, in that moment,
the storm clouds already gathering low and dark over the harbor in the distance. A warning the weather service had issued an hour earlier, promising the worst coastal storm the city had seen in a decade, due to make landfall within the week. The storm arrived faster than the forecasts had promised, and worse. By 9 that night, wind was tearing sideways off the harbor, rain coming down in sheets thick enough to blur the streetlights into smears of orange. Gabriel's phone rang just as he was locking up the site office, his foreman's voice tight with alarm on the other end. "The lower foundation trenches are filling faster than the pumps can clear them," the foreman said. "If this keeps up another hour, we're looking at flooding straight through to the retaining wall. And Gabriel, the water's already climbing toward the bistro's lower terrace too. It's all connected down there." Gabriel was already moving before the call ended, keys in hand, dialing Marlo as he ran for his truck. She picked up on the first ring, already breathless. "I know. I can see it from my window. The dock's half underwater already." "I'm on my way. Get whatever gear you have and meet me at the site." "I'm already outside." By the time Gabriel reached the waterfront, the scene was chaos in the worst way. Construction lights swinging wildly in the wind, workers in rain gear shouting over the roar of the storm, pumps straining against a rising tide that showed no sign of slowing. And there, in the middle of it, stood Marlo, soaked to the bone in a borrowed rain jacket 3 sizes too big, already directing 2 confused workers toward a drainage channel Gabriel didn't even know existed. "This whole site drains toward the old storm culvert," she shouted over the wind as Gabriel reached her, pointing toward a metal grate half-submerged near the boardwalk's edge. "The retention basin we designed can handle the runoff, but only if we redirect the overflow now, before the tide peaks. If we don't, it backs up straight into the foundation trenches and takes out both the site and my terrace." "Tell me what you need." "Sandbags along here, now, 3 rows deep." She was already moving, gesturing for the nearest crew to follow her toward the culvert. "And someone needs to manually open the secondary basin valve before the water gets high enough that nobody can reach it safely." Gabriel didn't hesitate. He grabbed a shovel from the nearest equipment pile and started hauling sandbags himself, working alongside his own crew in the pouring rain, mud and water soaking through boots that cost more than most of his workers made in a week. There was no security detail standing back watching, no suits, no distance, just Gabriel, soaked and straining, stacking bags shoulder to shoulder with men who, 3 weeks earlier, would never have imagined their boss doing this kind of work himself. Marlo waded toward the valve access point, water already at her knees, flashlight clenched between her teeth as she worked the rusted mechanism with both hands. "It's stuck!" she shouted back. "Don't force it alone," Gabriel called, dropping his shovel and splashing toward her through the rising water.
"There's no time to wait for." The valve gave suddenly, throwing her back a step as water surged through the newly opened channel, redirecting the flow away from the foundation trenches exactly as her design predicted. Gabriel caught her before she went down completely, both of them soaked and gasping, watching the water level along the boardwalk visibly begin to drop as the retention system finally did its job. "It's working," Marlo said, disbelief and relief tangled together in her voice. "It's working because you built it right," Gabriel said. They didn't have time to celebrate. For the next 3 hours, the two of them moved between the construction site and the bistro's lower terrace, directing crews, adjusting drainage points, shoring up sandbag lines wherever the water threatened to break through. Marlo's knowledge of the hydrology saved them more than once, catching a secondary overflow point nobody else had considered, redirecting a crew just minutes before a section of scaffolding would have flooded entirely. Gabriel's presence, meanwhile, kept the crew steady, working alongside them rather than shouting orders from dry ground, hauling equipment and sandbags until his arms ached and his voice was hoarse from being heard over the wind. By 2 in the morning, the worst of the storm had passed, moving inland and leaving the harbor soaked but standing. The construction site's foundation had held. The bistro's lower terrace, though flooded ankle-deep in places, hadn't suffered the structural damage it would have without the redirected drainage. Marlo's grandmother's dining room, the heart of the whole building, remained completely dry. They stood together at the edge of the boardwalk afterward, both of them soaked through, exhausted in a way that felt earned rather than defeated, watching the storm clouds finally break apart over the harbor to reveal a thin sliver of moon.
"You saved the site tonight," Gabriel said quietly. "We saved it," Marlowe corrected, echoing his words from the parking garage days earlier. "You were out here with a shovel at midnight. That's not nothing either." Around them, exhausted crew members were beginning to pack up equipment, several of them exchanging glances that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago, a quiet, new respect for the boss who'd worked beside them in the mud, and for the woman whose design had just saved both a multi-million-dollar project and a 40-year-old family restaurant in the same stormy night. One of the older foremen, a man named Castillo, who'd worked harbor construction for 2 decades, approached them both with something almost like awe in his weathered face.
"In 20 years," he said, "I've never seen a design hold up like that against a storm this bad, and I've never seen a developer pick up a shovel himself either." He looked between the two of them, soaked and standing close, and gave a short, tired laugh. "Whatever you two are doing together, don't stop." Marlowe glanced at Gabriel, exhaustion giving way to something warmer in her expression, despite the late hour and the ruined dress shoes she was fairly sure she'd never wear again.
"We don't plan to," she said.
Gabriel reached for her hand, mud-streaked and trembling slightly from hours of exertion, and held it steady in his own.
"Not even close to done,"
he agreed, and together they watched the last of the storm clouds drift out over the harbor, leaving the waterfront battered but whole, standing exactly where they'd fought to keep it.
Gabriel's office building had always felt too big for him. 40 floors of glass and steel his father had commissioned decades ago, back when the family name still needed a monument to prove it belonged among the city's elite. Gabriel had inherited the tower, along with everything else, the contracts, the connections, the quiet debts owed to men who preferred handshakes to paperwork. 1 week after Vance's removal from office, Gabriel sat at the head of a long conference table on the 38th floor, surrounded by 3 corporate lawyers and a stack of documents thick enough to require its own chair.
"You understand what you're asking us to do," said Priya Malhotra, the lead attorney, watching him carefully over the rim of her glasses.
"Liquidating the offshore holdings, dissolving the shell partnerships in Nassau and Grand Cayman, severing all remaining contracts with Delacroix Construction and the Ferretti Group. That's not a restructuring, Gabriel. That's dismantling the entire foundation your father built this company on." "I know exactly what I'm asking," Gabriel said. "I've known for weeks. I just needed the right reason to finally do it." "And that reason is?" Gabriel thought of Marlowe standing in the rain 3 weeks earlier, refusing to be intimidated by a man who terrified half the city.
He thought of her at the drafting table, tracing lines on a blueprint with the same care she'd have given her grandmother's recipes, and the way she'd looked at him afterward. Not with fear, not with flattery, but with the plain, uncomfortable honesty of someone who actually believed he could be better than the name he'd inherited.
"The reason," Gabriel said slowly, "is that I don't want to build anything else my father would recognize."
Priya studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded and slid the first folder across the table.
"Then let's start with Delacroix."
It took 4 hours to work through the paperwork, severing decades-old ties one signature at a time, each one a small, deliberate unraveling of the world Gabriel had grown up believing was the only way to survive in this city.
The Ferretti Group contract, which had quietly funneled untraceable payments through 3 shell companies for over a decade, dissolved with a single signature and a wire transfer that closed the account permanently. The offshore holdings in Nassau, worth more money than Gabriel had ever bothered calculating precisely, were liquidated and redirected into a public trust earmarked for affordable housing development. The kind of project Marlowe had described losing at Denholm Cross, rebuilt now under terms nobody could quietly gut behind closed doors. By the time the last document was signed, Gabriel Reyes had severed every remaining connection to the parts of his father's empire built on fear, leverage, and money that couldn't survive daylight. "There's one more thing," Gabriel said, once the lawyers had begun gathering their papers.
Priya paused. "There's always one more thing with you lately." Gabriel slid a fresh folder across the table, one he'd drafted himself over the past week, working late into the night after site visits and permit meetings, determined to get every word right.
"New corporate charter," he said. "Reyes Development dissolves entirely. In its place, a new firm. Fully transparent ownership structure, public filings, no shell partnerships, no offshore accounts. Sustainable urban development only. Affordable housing quotas built into every project from the ground up, not negotiated away after the fact." Priya scanned the document, eyebrows lifting slightly as she reached the ownership section. "You're restructuring executive equity too. 50% stake reserved for—" She looked up. "Marlo Voss, chief co-director." "That's correct." "Gabriel, this isn't a token position. This is equal control over every future decision this company makes." "I know exactly what it is," Gabriel said. "She's the only person I trust to make sure this firm never becomes what my father's company was. She caught a floodplain error that would have sunk the harbor project before it started. She stared down a corrupt inspector in the middle of a sabotage attempt without flinching. She's earned every bit of that stake. And honestly, the company's better for having her steer it than for having me steer it alone." Priya set the folder down slowly, something almost like respect crossing her usually guarded expression. "Your father would hate this." "My father built a company that hurt people to protect its own reputation," Gabriel said quietly. "I'd rather build one that helps people, even if it means giving up half of what I thought I owned outright." The papers were finalized by late afternoon, the new corporate charter filed with the state before the lawyers even left the building. The last remnants of Reyes Development quietly folding into something unrecognizable from what it had once been. Gabriel stood alone at the window afterward, looking out over the city skyline toward the harbor in the distance, the construction cranes visible even from 38 floors up, steady against a sky finally clear of storm clouds. His phone buzzed. A text from Marlo. "How'd it go?" He typed back, "It's done. All of it. Come by the office. There's something I need to show you." She arrived 20 minutes later, still in her work apron, flour dust on one sleeve, looking entirely out of place among the marble floors and glass walls of the executive suite, and not caring even slightly. Gabriel handed her the finalized charter without a word, watching her face as she read through the ownership structure, watching the moment she reached the equity section and went completely still. "Gabriel," she said quietly, "this is half the company." "It's yours," he said. "Chief co-director, equal say in every decision, every project, every dollar. I don't want to build anything without you steering it alongside me. Not because I need you to make it look good on paper, because I need you to make it actually good. There's a difference, and I only understood that difference after I met you." Marlo looked up at him, the folder trembling slightly in her hands, the same fierce, searching look she'd given him weeks earlier at her drafting table when she'd been deciding whether to trust him at all. "My grandmother always said the city eats people like us," she said softly, echoing the words from the rooftop weeks before. "Maybe it doesn't have to. Not if we build it differently." "Not if we build it together," Gabriel said, and this time, when she stepped forward and kissed him, there was no rain, no gala lights, no storm, just the quiet, steady certainty of two people who had finally stopped fighting the city long enough to start rebuilding it right. The boardwalk opened on a bright Saturday afternoon, exactly 40 days after the storm that had nearly taken it out before it was even finished. Marlo stood at the edge of the newly paved promenade, watching families stroll past the fresh railings, kids leaning over to watch the water lap gently against pilings that had been reinforced twice over the summer, once by her design, once again by the storm that had tested it. The old boardwalk had been cracked, uneven, half forgotten by a city that only remembered it existed when Vance tried to use it as a weapon.
The new one stretched clean and wide along the water, lined with young trees, public benches, and open sightlines to the harbor that Marlowe had insisted on from her very first sketch back at her drafting table months ago. And at the center of it all, exactly where her grandmother had built it 40 years before, stood the Harbor Bistro. Renovated now, its patio expanded, its faded awning replaced with something that still somehow felt like home, just sturdier. A brass plaque near the entrance read simply, "Established by Rosa Voss, rebuilt with love by her granddaughter." "You're staring at your own restaurant like a tourist," Gabriel said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of espresso, exactly the way he'd learned to make it after months of her patient, occasionally exasperated instruction.
"I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Marlowe admitted, taking the cup from him. "Old habit. Every time something good happens in this city, I brace for the other shoe." "No shoe today," Gabriel said. "Vance is 3 weeks into a formal indictment. The corruption task force found records going back 9 years. Inspectors, contractors, half the permit office. He won't be threatening anyone's restaurant again, not from a prison cell." "And Nikolai?" "Lost his firm's city contracts entirely after the floodplain scandal went public. Last I heard, he's consulting for a strip mall developer in another county." Gabriel allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Somewhere considerably less glamorous than a harbor gala. Marlowe laughed, leaning into him slightly as they walked the length of the new boardwalk together, greeting neighbors and old customers along the way. Mrs.
Alvarez from the flower shop, the Ferreira brothers who ran the bakery, even Castillo, the old foreman, who'd been hired on permanently as head of construction for Reyes Voss Development's next 3 projects, and now waved at them both with the easy familiarity of a man who'd worked beside them in a flood at midnight and never forgotten it. They reached the bistro's patio just as the lunch rush began to fill in, sunlight scattering off the water beyond the new railing, laughter drifting from tables crowded with people who had no idea how close this entire block had come to disappearing months earlier. Marlowe's staff moved through the tables with the same practiced rhythm she'd once run entirely alone, though now there were 4 servers instead of 2, and a kitchen large enough that she rarely had to step behind the line herself anymore, except when she wanted to.
Gabriel settled at his usual table by the window, the same table, Marlowe realized with a soft jolt, where he'd once stood soaked and furious, shouting for service on a rainy night that felt like a lifetime ago. He looked entirely different there now. No security detail waiting outside, no storm cloud of anger hanging over him. Just a man in a simple linen shirt, sleeves rolled up, watching the harbor traffic drift past the window with the quiet ease of someone who had finally stopped needing to prove anything to anyone.
"Chief Co-Director," Marlowe said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Would you like the special today, or are you still pretending you don't have a favorite?"
"I've had a favorite since the 2nd week," Gabriel admitted. "I was just too proud to say it out loud in front of your staff." "The grilled branzino." "The grilled branzino," he confirmed, and Marlowe laughed, waving toward the kitchen where one of the newer cooks, trained under her careful eye, was already plating the very same dish for a table nearby. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, watching the boardwalk fill with strangers who would never know the full story behind the ground they walked on, the sabotaged gas line, the corrupt inspector, the storm that nearly swallowed both a multi-million-dollar development and a 40-year-old family restaurant in the same terrifying night. All they'd see was a beautiful waterfront, honestly built, open to everyone rather than gated off for a fortunate few.
"Do you ever think about how this started?" Marlowe asked eventually, turning her cup slowly between her palms. "You, soaked, shouting at me because Vance ruined your afternoon?" "Constantly," Gabriel said. "Mostly because I still can't believe you didn't actually throw that tray at my head." "I came close. I deserved it." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I used to think building something meant forcing the world to bend around what I wanted. It took you threatening to finish me in the middle of your own restaurant to teach me the difference between forcing something
and actually earning it. Marlowe turned her hand beneath his, lacing their fingers together, watching the harbor light catch the water beyond the railing. My grandmother used to say, you build a legacy one honest choice at a time. Never the big dramatic moments people remember, just the small decisions, day after day,
That nobody's watching. She sounds like she was smarter than both of us combined.
She usually was. Marlowe smiled, glancing around the patio, full, alive, entirely hers and entirely theirs now, built on ground that had nearly been stolen twice and saved by nothing more complicated than honesty, stubbornness, and two people who refused to let a corrupt system win. Gabriel raised his espresso cup slightly, a small, private toast between them, unnoticed by the customers laughing and eating around them. To honest choices, he said. To building it right, Marlowe answered, and they clinked their cups together as the afternoon sun spread warm and golden across the new boardwalk. A harbor rebuilt, a bistro saved, and two people who had found, in each other, exactly the kind of partnership neither of them had ever expected to survive the storm that brought them together.